What happens when one of Hollywood's most intense, unpredictable actors sits across from one of television's most polished and unflappable interviewers? What happens when the calm professionalism of morning TV collides head-on with raw authenticity, the kind that doesn't play by anyone's rules? You're about to find out. Because what unfolded on Good Morning America that day wasn't just an interview. It was a battle of control, ego, and truth. And by the time it was over, no one in that studio would forget it. The segment began innocently enough. The bright, cheerful theme music faded, the cameras zoomed in, and George Stephanopoulos gave that familiar, practiced smile, the kind he'd worn through thousands of interviews. Across from him sat Tom Hardy, the British actor known for his intensity, his unpredictable energy, and his refusal to play the Hollywood game. Hardy wasn't there to cause trouble. He was there to promote his new film, a psychological thriller that critics were already calling one of his best performances yet. But anyone who's followed Tom Hardy's career knows he doesn't do small talk, and he definitely doesn't tolerate nonsense. He was dressed in his usual understated way, a plain black jacket over a gray t-shirt, no flashy accessories, no attempt to dress up for the cameras. His hands were clasped loosely in his lap, his posture relaxed but alert. Yet there was something in his eyes and that sharp, restless energy that hinted at a man who could turn from calm to confrontational in an instant. "Tom, thanks for joining us this morning," George began with his trademark smoothness. His voice was warm, polished, the tone of a man who knew how to keep interviews running like clockwork. "Your new film is getting incredible reviews," he continued, pausing for effect. "But before we get into that, I want to talk about something else first." A subtle shift rippled through the air. Hardy's expression didn't change immediately, but something behind his eyes did. He gave a polite smile, then adjusted slightly in his chair, just enough to suggest he was already bracing himself. "Sure, George," he said evenly. "What's on your mind?" George leaned forward slightly, sensing the gravity of the moment but mistaking it for control. "Well," he began, "there's been some controversy surrounding your recent comments about method acting and mental health. Some critics are saying you've been irresponsible in how you approach your craft." The words hung in the air like a spark in dry grass. For a brief second, the studio went completely still. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights above. Hardy blinked once, slow, deliberate. You could see him processing every syllable, every tone in George's voice. Then his jaw tightened ever so slightly. The expression that came over his face wasn't anger, not yet, but something colder. A kind of focused disbelief. "Irresponsible," Hardy repeated quietly. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath, the kind of quiet that makes everyone in the room instinctively hold their breath. "That's an interesting word choice, George," he said, leaning forward just enough for the camera to catch the intensity in his gaze. "Care to elaborate?" George smiled again, but it was tighter now. The control he'd thought he had was beginning to slip. Still, he pushed forward. "Well, several mental health advocates have criticized your recent interviews," he said carefully, "where you discussed diving deep into dark psychological spaces for your roles. They've suggested that kind of approach might glamorize unhealthy behavior or trivialize mental illness." Hardy tilted his head slightly, listening, really listening, but his eyes never left George's. It wasn't a glare. It was the look of someone stripping away the layers of conversation until only truth remained. "So let me get this straight," Hardy said finally. "You're saying that by committing to understanding the psychology of a character, by exploring the darker parts of the human condition, I'm being irresponsible?" "I'm not saying that," George replied quickly, his smile faltering just a touch. "But some people," Hardy interrupted, his tone cutting but quiet. "Some people make a living talking about other people's work without ever having done the work themselves." "Is that what you mean?" There was a pause, a long one. You could feel the tension vibrating through the studio. The audience, who'd expected an easy promotional chat, now sat frozen, watching something far more real unfold. George shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable, but tried to maintain his composure. "Tom, I think what people are concerned about is the message." "The message," Hardy repeated almost to himself. "See, that's the problem with interviews like this, George. You're not asking about the art. You're asking about the message. You're not interested in understanding You're interested in headlines. George tried to recover. That's not fair. No, what's not fair, Hardy cut in, his voice low but firm, is pretending that acting, real acting, is safe. It's not. It's about going places most people can't. It's about confronting the ugliest parts of yourself so that when the cameras roll, what you show is honest. Not clean, not convenient, honest. The silence that followed was electric. Even the production crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to cut to commercial or keep the cameras rolling. George blinked, forcing a small, uncomfortable laugh. Well, that's certainly one way of looking at it, he said, trying to smooth things over. Hardy leaned back, exhaling slowly, but his eyes remained sharp. It's not one way, mate, he said quietly. It's the only way I know. George hesitated, then, perhaps realizing he'd lost control of the conversation, tried to pivot. Let's talk about your film then, he said, voice lighter. It's been described as one of your darkest performances yet. How do you balance going to those emotional extremes with staying balanced? Hardy interjected with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You don't, that's the point. The audience chuckled nervously, unsure whether they were supposed to laugh. Hardy continued, his tone softening but his words cutting deep. You don't balance it. You live it. You dive in, and if you're lucky, you come out the other side with something worth showing people. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. George nodded, clearly trying to regain footing. But do you think that approach could be damaging to you personally? Hardy looked at him for a long moment, so long that the silence itself became uncomfortable. Then in a tone that was almost reflective, he said, You know what's damaging, George? Pretending. Pretending you care about art when what you really care about is controversy. Pretending you're asking tough questions when you're just fishing for something that'll trend. A few scattered gasps came from the audience. George blinked rapidly, his smile gone now. That's not fair, he began again. But Hardy didn't stop. No, it's not fair, he said. It's not fair to the people who watch this show thinking they're getting truth when all they're getting is curated outrage. You call it journalism, I call it theater. For several seconds, the studio was silent, completely silent. Then George, visibly shaken but still clinging to professionalism, managed a tight smile. Well, Tom Hardy, ladies and gentlemen, he said, glancing toward the camera. Always unfiltered. Hardy leaned back, gave a small smirk, and said softly, Always honest. And just like that, the interview ended. But the fallout had only begun. Within minutes, the clip hit social media. Hashtags like $TomHardyUnfiltered and $GMcClash exploded across platforms. Some viewers hailed Hardy as a truth-teller, someone finally calling out the hypocrisy of media culture. Others called him rude, arrogant, even dangerous. But one thing was certain, no one could look away. The air inside the Good Morning America studio had changed completely. What began as a standard morning interview had devolved into one of the most uncomfortable and electrifying exchanges ever caught on live television. George Stephanopoulos, seasoned anchor, former political advisor, and a man who'd faced presidents and generals, now sat visibly sweating under the studio lights. Across from him, Tom Hardy leaned forward, calm but clearly burning with restrained fury. The tension wasn't just thick, it was suffocating. They're saying you're glamorizing dangerous behavior, George repeated, trying to regain footing. And you agree with them? Hardy tilted his head, his Birmingham accent cutting through the studio air like a blade. They're saying? He echoed. And who exactly are they, George? Critics, bloggers? People who've never stepped foot on a film set in their lives? George straightened in his chair, his voice tightening. I'm asking the questions here, Tom. What do you say to parents who might be concerned about young actors following your example? For a moment, Hardy didn't move. He just stared. A long, silent, unnerving stare that stretched on for what felt like forever. The audience, usually a lively bunch, sat frozen in their seats. Even the sound technicians seemed afraid to breathe. Everyone could sense it. Something was about to snap. Finally, Hardy spoke. Parents should be concerned, he said quietly, about morning show hosts who do zero research before ambushing their guest with loaded questions based on secondhand gossip. Gasps rippled through the audience. George's professional smile wavered for the first time that morning. Tom, I don't think that's fair. We're just trying to have an honest conversation. Honest? Hardy repeated, laughing once, a short, humorless sound that didn't reach his eyes. George, mate, if you wanted an honest conversation, you would have told my publicist about this line of questioning. You would have done your homework instead of reading talking points off a teleprompter. But that's not what this is it? I think our viewers deserve to hear your response to these legitimate concerns, George countered, his voice slightly shaking now. Hardy's tone sharpened. Your viewers deserve better than this tabloid garbage masquerading as journalism. That line hit like a punch. Even Whoopi Goldberg, watching from backstage for her segment later, reportedly muttered, "Oh, damn." Under her breath. Hardy wasn't yelling and he didn't need to. His control made every word sting harder. Tell me, George, he continued, leaning forward. When was the last time you researched method acting? When did you actually speak to a mental health professional about the therapeutic benefits of exploring dark emotions in a controlled, professional environment? George shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Tom, I think you're being defensive here. Defensive? Hardy repeated, eyebrows raising in disbelief. George, I came here at 5 in the bloody morning to talk about a film I've poured my heart into. Instead, you're trying to corner me with half-truths and clickbait headlines. That's not being defensive. That's called having standards. George forced a chuckle, trying to appear unfazed. Well, the quotes speak for themselves, do they? Hardy asked, his tone dropping low and dangerous. Because I'd love to hear which specific quotes you're referring to. Can you cite them for me? Word for word? The silence that followed was devastating. George looked down at his notes, flipping pages that suddenly seemed blank. Well, there have been several interviews where you discussed your intense preparation methods. Several interviews, Hardy repeated slowly. But you can't name one. You can't tell me which publication, which journalist, or what exact words I supposedly said. Can you? Tom, I think we're getting off track here. George tried again, his voice tightening with strain. No, Hardy said firmly, eyes locked on him. We're finally on track. You've accused me of being irresponsible, of influencing young actors in dangerous ways, but you can't even tell me what I supposedly said. That's not journalism, mate. That's character assassination based on hearsay. The camera cut briefly to the audience. Some looked stunned, others thrilled, a few visibly uncomfortable. I have the information right here, George stammered, shuffling his cue cards, then read it. Hardy demanded, calm but unrelenting. Read me the exact quote that has you so concerned about my influence. George's fingers trembled as he shuffled through his notes again. You could see the faint sheen of sweat forming on his forehead. Finally, he muttered, the specific quote isn't as important as the overall pattern of statements. That was it. The line that broke the dam. The specific quote isn't important? Hardy's voice rose for the first time, though it still carried that eerie, measured intensity. George, you just spent 5 minutes questioning my professional integrity on live television based on something you can't even quote. And now you're telling me the words don't matter? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Hardy shot back, cutting him off. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you invited me here under false pretenses just to ambush me with accusations you can't even properly articulate. The tension was now a living thing in the room. You could almost hear the studio's air conditioning struggling against the heat, radiating from that exchange. Crew members in the background were exchanging nervous looks, whispering frantically into headsets. One producer could be seen gesturing for the director to cut to commercial, but the control room hesitated. This was television gold. George cleared his throat, trying desperately to redirect. Tom, let's talk about your new film. The character you play deals with some heavy themes, but Hardy wasn't letting him off that easy. He leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, voice low but burning. No, George, we're not done here. You just spent several minutes accusing me of being a bad influence without evidence. You owe your viewers an explanation. I think we should move on, George said weakly. I think you should answer the question, Hardy countered. You brought up these so-called mental health advocates who are apparently worried about me. Name one. Give me a single name of someone who has specifically criticized my approach. George blinked, clearly panicking now. Tom, there have been several articles, Hardy repeated. But no names. No quotes, no facts. You can't provide a single example, can you? The silence that followed was excruciating. Hardy tilted his head, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. George, do you realize you're doing exactly what you accuse me of? You're spreading half-baked narratives without evidence. You're damaging reputations with vague, unsubstantiated claims and calling it journalism. That's not the same thing, isn't it? Hardy pressed. Because you just told millions of people that mental health advocates think I'm dangerous. You told parents they should be worried about me. But you can't name one person, one source, one shred of proof. That's not reporting. That's gossip dressed up in a suit. The camera lingered on George's face, pale, tense, and visibly rattled. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. We have producers who research these topics, he said finally, almost pleading. Your producers, Hardy repeated softly, shaking his head. There was no anger in his tone now, just disappointment. Right, so let me ask you something, George. He leaned back, folding his arms. How long have you been in journalism? George looked confused. Over 30 years, he said cautiously. 30 years, Hardy repeated. And in all that time, no one taught you to verify your sources before making accusations on live television? That line hit hard. The audience murmured again, a low ripple of shock and awe. George glanced toward the control booth, silently pleading for rescue, but the cameras were still rolling. Hardy stood slowly, removing his mic. I came here to talk about art, not defend my humanity, he said quietly. Next time, do your homework. He set the mic down gently on the desk and walked off set, leaving George sitting there, stunned, speechless, and utterly exposed. The screen faded awkwardly to a commercial for cereal. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Tom Hardy Live, Jammer G. Macklash, and Journalism V's Truth were trending worldwide. Clips of the confrontation were shared millions of times, with fans praising Hardy for refusing to be cornered. Some called it arrogance. Others called it bravery. But everyone agreed on one thing. No one had ever seen George Stephanopoulos. The tension in the Good Morning America studio was now unbearable. You could almost feel the oxygen leaving the room. George Stephanopoulos, usually the picture of calm professionalism, sat rigid in his chair, his jaw tight, his notes trembling slightly in his hands. Across from him, Tom Hardy was motionless, no smirk, no bravado, just a sharp, focused intensity that cut through the set like a blade. That's not relevant, George finally said, his voice taut but measured. Hardy leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked on the host. I think it's very relevant, actually, he replied, his tone deceptively calm. Because what you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's gossip, the kind of lazy, irresponsible reporting that gives actual journalists a bad name. You could see the color rising in George's face. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not live on his own show. Tom, he said, forcing a strained smile, I don't appreciate your tone. And I don't appreciate being ambushed on live television. Hardy shot back, his voice dropping half an octave. By someone who couldn't be bothered to do basic fact-checking before making serious accusations. But here we are. That line hit hard. The studio audience sat frozen. Not a cough, not a whisper. Just the low hum of studio lights and cameras recording every second of the confrontation. Hardy continued, gesturing toward the host's stack of cue cards. You invited me here under the pretense of discussing my work. You promised a conversation about film, craft, creativity, and instead, the moment the camera started rolling, you launched into an attack, based on information you can't even verify. That's not hosting, George. That's entrapment. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. You could see members of the production crew exchanging panicked glances. A stage manager frantically signaling toward the control booth. Cut to commercial, but no one dared make the call. Tom, I think you're overreacting, George said finally, his voice strained but still trying to project authority. Hardy's eyes darkened. He leaned in, lowering his voice to that quiet, deliberate tone that somehow carried even more menace. Overreacting? George, you've just accused me of potentially harming young actors, of being irresponsible about mental health, of being a bad influence. You implied that I'm some sort of danger to the people who look up to me, and you did all of this without a single shred of evidence. So tell me, how exactly would you like me to react? George opened his mouth but hesitated. Hardy pressed on. These are legitimate questions about celebrity responsibility, you said? Based on what exactly? Show me the study. Show me the expert opinion. Show me anything other than your producer's interpretation of what someone might have said about something I might have done. There it was, the cutting precision that made Tom Hardy's characters so magnetic and terrifying on screen. And now that same energy was alive, unscripted and raw in front of millions. George looked down at his notes again, clearly stalling. The concerns have been raised in various media outlets, he said weakly. Various media outlet, Hardy echoed, his accent sharpening. George, do you hear yourself? You sound like a politician caught in a corruption scandal. Various sources say people are concerned. It's been reported. These are weasel words, mate. This is how people talk when they're making things up. George's jaw clenched. I'm not making anything up. Then prove it, Hardy said, eyes flashing. Right now, on air. Show me one specific example of what you're talking about. The pause that followed was deafening. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. George shuffled his papers again, eyes darting to the camera, then back to Hardy, clearly hoping anyone, would save him. Tom, he said finally, I think we're spending too much time on this. No, Hardy countered, his voice low but cutting. We're spending exactly the right amount of time on this. You made serious accusations about my professional character, and now you're trying to run away when asked to back them up. That's not how this works. George tried to reassert himself. Nobody's running away from anything. Then stop deflecting, Hardy said, leaning in closer, and answer the question. One name, one quote, one piece of actual evidence for any of the claims you've made. You could see the sweat now glistening on George's forehead under the studio lights. His polished newsman composure was cracking. Tom, our research team compiled information from multiple sources. Your research team, Hardy repeated slowly, the words almost dripping with contempt. Compiled information. George, that's not an answer. That's corporate speak. You're hiding behind your research team the same way you're hiding behind these anonymous critics and vague concerns. I'm not hiding behind anything, George insisted, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Then take responsibility, Hardy said flatly. Either admit you don't have specific information to back up your accusations or provide it. Stop trying to have it both ways. The cameras caught it all. George glancing off screen, lips tightening, eyes flicking toward his producers, silently begging for help. No one came. The control room knew cutting to commercial now would only confirm Hardy's point. Tom, George said after a long pause, I think our viewers would prefer to hear about your new film. Hardy let out a humorless laugh and shook his head slowly. Your viewers deserve better than this, he said. They deserve honesty. They deserve hosts who do their homework instead of ambushing guests with tabloid rumors and half-baked talking points. You call this journalism, but it's not. It's entertainment dressed up as moral outrage. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Hardy leaned back in his chair, exhaling quietly. You know what's funny, George? He said, almost conversationally. You accuse me of being irresponsible, of blurring the line between performance and reality. But look at what's happening right now. You've turned a discussion about storytelling and emotion into a spectacle, because conflict gets clicks. Outrage sells. That's not journalism, mate. That's show business. The only difference is I admit what I'm doing, the audience murmured, softly at first, then louder. A few even clapped. It wasn't supposed to happen, but once it started, the momentum couldn't be stopped. George straightened, clearly flustered. All right, he said stiffly, let's get back to the movie. But Hardy wasn't finished. You want to talk about the movie now? He asked, eyes narrowing. Now that you've spent 10 minutes questioning my mental stability and ethics? Fine. Let's talk about the film. It's about truth, accountability, and the cost of integrity. Pretty fitting, don't you think? A few laughs broke out from the audience. Even some crew members couldn't hide their smirks. George forced a tight smile, his professionalism on life support. We appreciate your time, Tom. Hardy stood, unclipping his microphone with deliberate calm. No, George. You appreciate the headlines this'll get you, he said, and you're welcome for that. But next time, have the decency to treat your guests like humans instead of headlines. He placed the mic gently on the table, gave a polite nod to the audience, and walked off set. George sat there frozen, his expression blank. The studio was silent again, a stunned, almost reverent silence. Then the director's voice came over the intercom. Cut to commercial now. The screen faded awkwardly to a bright, cheery advertisement for breakfast cereal, the kind of jarring contrast only live television can produce. But it was too late. The clip was already making its way online. Within an hour, Tom Hardy Live and Hardy vs. George were trending globally. Millions of viewers rewatched the exchange, dissecting every line, every glare, every pause. Some called Hardy arrogant, others called him a hero. But everyone agreed they had never seen anything like it. And George Stephanopoulos? He would finish the broadcast, smile through the rest of the segment, and walk off set in silence. He had just learned the hardest lesson of live TV. Never pick a fight with someone who knows how to own the camera better than you do.